The house wasn't hers, the name wasn't hers. Even the bed she slept in had belonged to another woman first, and everyone in Millhaven knew it. Cecily Ashford had been married 11 months before she understood that the house on Birch Hollow Road was not a home she had entered. It was a position she had been appointed to fill. Her mother had arranged it in the spring of 1887, in the particular way that women of diminished circumstances arranged things, quickly, quietly, with a smile that didn't reach the eyes and a handshake that did. Franklin Ashford was 41 years old, a widower with a dry goods business that supplied half the county, a son of 9 named Owen who looked at Cecily like she was furniture that had arrived in the wrong room, and a mother, Mrs. Constance Ashford, who had not been consulted and did not forgive it. Cecily had been 23. She had said yes because her family needed her to say yes, and because no one had asked her what she wanted, and because the asking, by that point, felt like a door that had been quietly closed while she was looking somewhere else. She had arrived at the Ashford house on a Wednesday in June, with 2 trunks and a small cedar box of her mother's letters that she kept under the bed because she needed something in the room that belonged to her. She had been there 11 months. She had learned the route of the house. She had learned the way Owen needed his eggs in the morning, soft but not runny, and the way Mrs. Constance Ashford took her tea, dark with no sugar and delivered before 8 or not at all. She had learned that Franklin Ashford was not unkind. He was simply absent. He was at the store before she woke and home after Owen was in bed, and when he was in the room with her, he had the quality of a man conducting an obligation he intended to fulfill with precision if not enthusiasm. She had learned, in other words, that a marriage could be technically intact and still be entirely empty. She had not told anyone this. There was no one to tell. The letter arrived on a Thursday in May. She found it on the writing desk in the front parlor, already opened, the seal broken in the careless way of someone who had decided the contents were their business. Franklin was not yet home. Owen was at school. Mrs. Constance Ashford was in the back garden doing something that required a hat and a disapproving expression. The letter was addressed to Cecily. It had been opened by someone else. She stood with it in her hands and read it twice. It was from her cousin Nance, who lived in Fredericksburg. Nance was not a subtle woman. She wrote the way she spoke, in long rushing sentences that didn't always end where they started, and what she had written was this: that she had seen, at a social gathering 3 weeks prior, a man named Mr. Arthur Graves, who was a business associate of Franklin Ashford's, and that Mr. Graves had said something at dinner that Nance had not been able to stop thinking about since, that Franklin Ashford's first marriage, the one everyone in Millhaven spoke of with soft voices and downcast eyes, the one to the late Eleanor Ashford who had died of fever 4 years ago and left him a widower with a young son, and a grief that people found tasteful and appropriate, that marriage had not been the love story the county believed it was. That Eleanor Ashford had spent the last 2 years of her life trying to leave. That she had written to her sister in Baltimore 3 times asking for money and a place to go. That the reason she had never left was that the money never came, and the reason the money never came was that Franklin Ashford had written to his wife's family before Eleanor did, and had told them something about Eleanor that wasn't true. Nance didn't know exactly what he'd said. Mr. Consley Graves had been imprecise at that point in the evening, possibly because the wine had loosened his tongue past what good judgment would allow, and possibly because he didn't know the full particulars either. But what he knew, he had said, and what he had said, Nance had written down, and what Nance had written, someone in this house had opened before Cecily ever touched it. She folded the letter. She set it down on the desk exactly where she'd found it. She went to the kitchen and started the pot for dinner, and she did not say a word when Franklin came home at 6:30 and sat down at the table and asked if there was any mail. "There was a letter for my cousin," she said, and watched his face. Nothing moved in it. That was the thing. Nothing moved at all. "Anything of interest?" he said. "Nothing urgent," she said. And she set the bread on the table and went back to the kitchen and stood at the stove and understood that she was in a position she had not fully understood before that moment. She had known the marriage was empty. She had not known it might be something worse than empty. She spent 3 days thinking about it. She was good at thinking quietly, without letting it show, because she had been doing it her whole life in houses where the thinking had to be invisible, or it became a problem for someone else to manage. She kept the house running. She delivered Mrs. Constance Ashford's tea before 8. She helped Owen with his arithmetic in the evenings, which he accepted with the grudging tolerance of a child who did not want to like her, and kept finding, against his intentions, that he did. On the third night, she wrote to Nance. She asked for Mr. Graves's full name and how to reach him. She asked what else Nance remembered from that dinner. Every detail, even the ones that didn't seem to matter. She asked whether anyone else at the table had heard what Mr. Graves said, and if so, who they were. She asked all of this in the calm, organized manner she used for household accounts. The one she developed out of necessity because no one in this house had kept a proper ledger before she arrived, and the books had been running on optimism and guesswork. She sent the letter with the hired boy on a morning when Mrs. Constance Ashford was at church, and Franklin was at the store, and she did not leave a copy on the writing desk. Nance wrote back in 6 days. She was, as mentioned, not a subtle woman, but she was a thorough one, and the letter she returned was 4 pages and contained the name of every person who had been at that dinner, what they had been drinking, and a physical description of Mr. Tive, Arthur Graves, that included his approximate height, the color of his waistcoat, and the fact that he had a habit of rubbing the back of his neck when he said something he wasn't sure about. There was also a name Cecily hadn't expected. Eleanor Ashford's sister in Baltimore was called Mrs. Bester, Penelope Farrow, and, according to Nance, who had asked around with the persistence of a woman who had decided a thing was worth asking, Mrs. Farrow was still alive, still in Baltimore, and, according to a mutual acquaintance of Nance's who had met her once at a Presbyterian social, still very much of the opinion that something had gone wrong with her sister's death and no one had ever properly looked at it. Cecily set that letter down on the cedar box under the bed. She sat on the edge of the mattress in the room she shared with a man she barely knew, and felt the full shape of what she was looking at. She could do nothing. That was the first option. She could fold both letters into something small and put them away and keep delivering tea before 8 and helping Owen with his arithmetic and managing the household accounts that no one had asked her to fix, but that she'd fixed anyway because she couldn't stand to watch numbers that didn't add up. She could do nothing, and the marriage would continue as it was, technically intact and entirely empty, and she would grow old in a house that belonged to someone else's history. Or she could write to Mrs. Penelope Farrow in Baltimore. She wrote the letter that night. She wrote it 4 times before she found the version that said exactly what she meant, without excess and without apology. And she sent it the following morning. The reply took 10 days and arrived on a Saturday when the whole house was in some kind of movement. Owen at his friend's, Franklin at the store taking inventory. Mrs. Constance Ashford visiting the Whitley family 3 streets over. Cecily sat at the kitchen table in the morning quiet and read it alone. Mrs. Penelope Farrow wrote carefully. She wrote like a woman who had spent years deciding whether to trust people and had developed very precise criteria. She said that she had received 3 letters from her sister Eleanor in the last 2 years of Eleanor's life. She said that all 3 letters had asked for money and a place to go. She said that she had replied to all 3 with offers of both. She said that her sister had never responded to those replies, and that she had assumed Eleanor had changed her mind, chosen her marriage, decided to stay. She said that it had taken her 3 years and a conversation with a seamstress in Millhaven who came to visit a Baltimore relative to discover that Eleanor's replies to her letters had never been sent. They had been found in a writing box that Franklin Ashford had sold after Eleanor's death to a second-hand dealer in town. The seamstress's Baltimore relative had bought the box and found the letters inside, unsent, sealed, addressed, never mailed. Mrs. Farrow had the letters. She had kept them for a year. She had not known what to do with them, who to send them to, who would believe her. She asked Cecily a careful question at the end of 4 pages. Why are you asking, and what do you intend to do with what I tell you? Cecily wrote back the same afternoon. She said, I am asking because I live in that house now. I intend to understand what I am living in before I decide what to do about it. I am not asking you to do anything you are not willing to do. I am only asking you to tell me the truth." Mrs. Farrow wrote back in 8 days. She said she would come to Millhaven. She arrived on a Tuesday, which was the day Franklin was reliably at the county market until past 4. Cecily had arranged it. She had developed, over 11 months, a comprehensive knowledge of everyone's schedule in this house, which had started as a matter of practicality and was now something else entirely. Mrs. Farrow was a woman in her late 40s with a straight back and the kind of face that had decided several things about the world and wasn't interested in revising them without evidence. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Cecily had read her letter, and she put the 3 unsent letters between them and a 4th document that Cecily had not known existed, a letter from Franklin Ashford to Eleanor's father, written 4 years before Eleanor's death, in which Franklin had described his wife as unstable, prone to delusion, and likely to make claims about her circumstances that should not be trusted. The letter was dated 6 weeks after Eleanor had first written to her family asking for help. Cecily looked at it for a long time. "He made sure no one would believe her," she said. "Before she'd said anything," Mrs. Farrow said. "He wrote that letter before her first request for help ever reached her father. Her father received it, and when Eleanor's letter arrived a week later asking to come home, he thought she was already proving Franklin right." Cecily picked up the letter and put it down again. "How did you get this?" "Eleanor's father died 2 years ago. I went through his correspondence." Mrs. Farrow's hands were folded on the table, very still. "He kept everything. He was a meticulous man. He kept the letter that told him not to believe his daughter, and he never questioned it. And I don't think he ever stopped regretting that, though he never said so directly." They sat in the kitchen for another hour. Cecily asked questions. Mrs. Farrow answered them. Between the letters and the dates and the timeline that assembled itself across the kitchen table, it was clear enough, not the kind of clear that a court would immediately call proof, but the kind of clear that a person who kept household ledgers recognized. The numbers didn't lie, and the numbers here told the story that had been very carefully managed for a very long time. When Mrs. Farrow left, she left copies of everything. She took the originals back to Baltimore and said she would send a sworn account from the seamstress's relative, if Cecily needed it. Cecily sat alone in the kitchen for a long time after the door closed. The thing about a position you'd been appointed to fill was that it looked the same from the outside whether or not you knew what you were filling it for. The county saw Mrs. Franklin Ashford, a young wife in a decent house with a well-behaved stepson and a husband who provided. They saw a woman who had arrived to manage a widower's household with quiet efficiency and no particular fuss. They saw exactly what everyone had intended them to see. They did not see a woman sitting at a kitchen table with 4 letters that changed the shape of everything. She had 3 choices. She had thought about this the way she thought about the household accounts, not in terms of what she felt, but in terms of what was true and what it required. First, she could take what she had to a lawyer. Second, she could go to the county paper, which was edited by a man named Mr. Silas Holt, who had a reputation for fairness and a personal dislike of stories that didn't add up. Third, she could confront Franklin directly. The third option she dismissed inside 10 minutes. She had seen what happened when Eleanor had tried that approach, not in words, but in documents. The preemptive letter, the managed narrative, the sealed replies. Franklin Ashford, whatever else he was not a man who was caught off guard. He was a man who prepared the ground ahead of the rain. She thought about the first auction for 2 days. A lawyer would need the originals, and the originals were in Baltimore. And more importantly, a lawyer would move at a pace that gave Franklin time to do what he always did, which was write the letter before the letter arrived. On the 3rd day, she put on her coat and walked to the offices of the Millhaven Register. Mr. Silas Holt was a man of 60 with ink on his hands, and the expression of someone who had spent decades reading between the lines of everything people told him, and had developed an allergy to the ones that didn't match. He looked at Cecily Ashford across his desk with the careful attention of a man who did not yet know whether she was telling him something real or something convenient. She laid out what she had. The copies of the 3 unsent letters. The preemptive letter to Eleanor's father, the timeline she had assembled herself on 2 sheets of paper in the same format she used for household accounts. The name and address of Mrs. Penelope Farrow. The name of the seamstress's relative in Baltimore who had found the writing box. She said, "I am not asking you to print anything today. I am asking you to determine whether this is what it appears to be. If it isn't, I want to know that too." Mr. Holt looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the papers. "Why did you come to me?" he said. "Why not a lawyer?" "Because a lawyer would notify my husband," she said. "And my husband is very good at writing letters in advance of problems." Something shifted in Mr. Holt's expression. Not quite belief, not yet, but the alertness of a man whose instinct had just agreed with something. He picked up the timeline she'd assembled and read it without speaking for several minutes. "Mrs. Ashford," he said finally, "how long have you been sitting on this?" 3 weeks, she said. "I wanted to be sure I wasn't assembling something that wasn't there." "And are you sure?" "I am sure enough to bring it to you," she said. "I'll let you determine the rest." She left without making him promise anything because she had learned from 11 months of managing a household that you didn't ask people to promise things they weren't ready to promise. You gave them what you had and you let them find their way to it. That evening at dinner, Franklin Ashford asked if she had been out that afternoon. "I walked to the post office," she said. It was not entirely untrue. She had passed the post office on the way back. He looked at her for a moment with the neutral expression that was his primary mode, the one she had spent 11 months learning to read and had not yet fully decoded. Then he went back to his plate. Owen, across the table, was watching her with his own version of the look he'd been developing for 11 months. The one that had started as suspicion and had migrated, without his cooperation, toward something more complicated. He was 9 years old, and he was not a simple child. She had suspected this from the beginning, and the arithmetic evenings had confirmed it. "You made the bread differently," he said. "I did," she said. "Do you like it?" He thought about it with the seriousness he applied to most things. "It's better," he said, as if this was information he was releasing against his better judgment. "Thank you, Owen," she said. Franklin said nothing. He ate the bread. Mr. Holt came to the house 4 days later. He came to the front door in the middle of the afternoon, which was either bold or calculated, and Cecily suspected it was both. Mrs. Constance Ashford answered the door, because Mrs. Constance Ashford answered the door. Constance Ashford answered every door in this house as if opening it herself was a matter of territorial importance, and she stood in the doorway with the expression she reserved for people whose presence required explanation. "I've come to speak with Mrs. Ashford," Mr. Holt said pleasantly. "I have a question about a household account that requires her specific attention." It was not true, but it was the kind of not true that a woman who kept immaculate household accounts could make plausible, and Mrs. Constance Ashford, whatever else she thought of her daughter-in-law, had never once disputed the accounts. She was shown to the front parlor. Mr. Holt came in and sat down, and Cecily came in from the kitchen and closed the door, and Mrs. Constance Ashford remained in the hallway for approximately 30 seconds before her footsteps moved away toward the back of the house. "I wrote to Mrs. Farrow," Mr. Holt said. "I know," Cecily said. "She wrote to tell me. She is willing to provide a sworn statement. The seamstress's relative is also willing." He set his hat on his knee. "I have read everything you gave me 4 times, Mrs. Ashford, and I have spent the last 4 days speaking with people in this town about Franklin Ashford's business and his first marriage, carefully, indirectly, in the way I've been doing this for 30 years. She waited. "What I can tell you," he said, "is that there are 3 people in this county who know something about what happened to Eleanor Ashford's correspondence, and none of them have spoken about it publicly because not one of them had reason to believe anyone would listen." He paused. "You have given them a reason." Cecily looked at the man across the parlor. He had the specific expression of a journalist who had found the story underneath the story and was now deciding what his responsibility to it was. "Are you going to print it?" she said. "I'm going to give your husband an opportunity to respond to what I found." He said, "That is what I do. If he responds, I'll print his response alongside the account. If he doesn't, I'll print the account without it." She had expected this. When? "I'll speak to him at the store tomorrow morning. I won't tell him where the information came from." "He'll know," she said. "Yes," Mr. Holt said. "He will. I want you to understand that." "I understand it." He looked at her steadily. "You are 23 years old, Mrs. Ashford, and you live in this man's house." "I'm aware," she said. "I want to ask whether you thought about what happens next." "I've thought about very little else for 3 weeks," she said. "I don't have family I can go to immediately. My mother is in poor health, and I won't add this to her situation. I have a cousin in Fredericksburg who would take me in if I needed it. I have the household account ledger, which I've kept for 11 months and which is entirely in my hand, and which documents the running of this house in a way that would be relevant to any legal proceeding about its finances." She paused. "I have also, in the last 2 weeks, made copies of everything and sent them to Mrs. Farrow for safekeeping." Mr. Holt was quiet for a moment. "You planned for this," he said. "I kept accounts," she said. "It's the same thing." He left 10 minutes later. Mrs. Barres, Constance Ashford, materialized from the direction of the kitchen with a cup of tea she hadn't been asked to make, and the expression of a woman who had heard more than a conversation about household accounts. She set the cup down in front of Cecily and stood there. She was 70 years old. Franklin's mother, a woman who had spent her life being an Ashford and who had not forgiven anyone for anything in recent memory. She had not forgiven Cecily for arriving without her consultation. She had not forgiven the household accounts for being better than what she'd kept herself. She had not, Cecily sometimes thought, forgiven the sun for rising in the east when west would have been more convenient, but she stood there with the tea and she said very quietly, "Eleanor used to cry at night." Cecily looked up at her. "I heard her," Mrs. Constance Ashford said. "Twice, maybe 3 times. I told myself it was the fever later, that she'd been unwell for a long time." She stopped. "I should not have told myself that." She walked out of the parlor without another word. Cecily sat with the tea and felt the weight of it. Not just the letters, not just the ledgers, but the 11 months of learning a house and finding out what it had been hiding in its walls, and the specific, uncomfortable truth that the hiding had required more than one person's silence. Franklin came home at 6. He was, for the first time in 11 months, home before his usual time. He came in through the front door and went directly to the parlor and stood in the doorway and looked at her. She did not put down what she was doing, which was the household ledger, the current one, the real one. "I had a visitor at the store today," he said. "I know," she said. The silence between them was the kind that had furniture in it. "You went to the paper," he said. "I went to the paper," she agreed. "Cicely." He came into the room and stopped 6 feet from where she was sitting. He had his hands at his sides and his face was doing the thing it did when he was thinking faster than he was speaking, which she had learned to read like weather. "What you think you know, I know what I know," she said. "I've spent 11 months learning how to read this house and everyone in it. I did not come to conclusions quickly. There are things about Eleanor that you don't understand. There are things about Eleanor that you made sure no one would understand," she said. "You wrote to her father 6 weeks after she first asked him for help, and you told him she was unstable. You wrote that letter before he received hers. I have the dates." He was very still. That same stillness she'd seen at dinner when she said nothing urgent. "Where did you get?" "It doesn't matter where I got them," she said. "What matters is that they exist and that Mr. Worrall Holt has spoken with 3 people in this town who've been waiting for a reason to say what they know." Franklin sat down. It was not a calculated movement. It was the movement of a man whose legs had made a decision without consulting him, and it told Cecily more than anything he had said in 11 months of marriage. "What do you want?" he said. She had thought about this question for 3 weeks, which was how long she'd been thinking about everything else, and she had an answer that was not what he was expecting, which was why she'd prepared it carefully. "I want the truth told," she said, "not because it benefits me specifically, though it will require a reckoning. Not to destroy you, though I understand that is how it will feel, but because Eleanor Ashford wrote 3 letters asking for help, and someone made sure no one believed her, and she died in a house she was trying to leave, and there are people in this county who have been carrying what they know about that for 4 years and have had nowhere to put it." She set down the ledger. "I also want the house accounts transferred to my name, the ones I've been keeping. I want it documented that I have managed this household for 11 months and that the records are mine." Franklin looked at her across the parlor. Outside, the May evening was doing what May evenings did in Virginia, pressing through the windows with the warmth of a season that didn't care about the things happening inside houses. "And if I contest it," he said, "all of it, then Mr. Holt prints what he has," she said, "which is considerably more than your denial will be able to address, and Mrs. Farrow sends her sworn statement to the county courthouse, and the seamstress's relative sends hers, and the 3 people in this town who have been quiet for 4 years find that they are no longer the only ones speaking." He looked at her for a long time. She had expected anger. She had prepared for it the way you prepared for weather when you'd been watching the sky for days. What she had not prepared for was what actually moved across his face, which was something older and more tired than anger, something that looked unexpectedly like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had arrived at the moment he'd been half expecting and was not entirely sorry it had come. "I didn't want her to die," he said. It came out quiet. It came out like something that had been in a room alone for a long time and had finally found air. "I know," she said, because she did know, or believed it, which for her purposes was close enough to the same. "But wanting is not the thing that matters here. What matters is what you did and what you're going to do now." Mrs. Constance Ashford appeared in the doorway at that moment. She had the expression of a woman who had been in the hallway for some portion of this conversation and had made a decision about something. "Franklin," she said. Her son looked up at her. "Do what she's asking," she said. And then she walked away, which was the most words Cecily had ever heard her say without waiting for a response. The county register ran the account on a Friday. Mr. Bagelite, Holt had written it with the precision of a man who had spent 30 years finding the shape of things that other people found shapeless. It was not sensational. It was not cruel. It was the kind of journalism that trusted its facts to do the work and did not reach for effect. Mrs. Farrow's sworn statement ran alongside it. So did a brief, formal statement from Franklin Ashford himself, which he had written and given to Mr. Holt 2 days before publication, and which said that the account of his first wife's attempts to leave the marriage was accurate, that he had obstructed her communications with her family, and that he accepted responsibility for what that had prevented her from doing. It was not enough. It was also more than most people had expected him to say. The county received it the way counties received things that confirmed what they'd half known and hadn't wanted to look at directly, with discomfort, with relief, with the specific social rearrangement that happened when a story that had been told one way was told another. The Ashford business continued. Franklin did not flee or collapse. He was not a man who fled or collapsed. He was a man who had been brought to an accounting, which was different, and who was conducting himself through it with the precise, joyless discipline of someone paying a debt he'd hoped to avoid. Mrs. Constance Ashford said nothing further about it directly, but 2 weeks after the register published, she appeared at breakfast with a different quality of silence. And she poured Cecily's tea without being asked, and she did it before 8 o'clock. It was, from her, an extraordinary gesture. Owen found out from a boy at school, which was not how Cecily would have chosen it, but was how it happened. Because 9-year-olds were not insulated from newspapers in households that kept them on the table. He came home on a Wednesday with his coat half-buttoned and his arithmetic unfinished, and went directly to the kitchen where Cecily was working, and stood in the door with the expression of a child who had been thinking hard for several hours and had arrived at something. "The boy at school," said my father. He stopped, started again. "He said my mother tried to leave." Cecily set down what she was doing and turned to face him. "Yes," she said. "She did." Owen stood in the kitchen doorway. He was a child who did not cry easily. He had not cried in 11 months that she had witnessed, and he did not cry now. But something in his face moved through several things in quick succession, and arrived at a kind of exhausted openness that she had not seen in him before. "She didn't get to," he said. "No," Cecily said. "She didn't. Because of my father." "Yes." He stood there for a moment longer. Then he came into the kitchen and sat down at the table and picked up his unfinished arithmetic and started working on it. After a few minutes he said, without looking up, "I don't know what I'm supposed to think." "You don't have to know right now," she said. "You have time to figure it out." "Do you know what to think?" he asked. "I know what I think," she said. "I think your mother was in a very hard situation and she tried to get out of it and she was stopped. And I think that's true even though I also believe your father is not entirely the person that sounds like. People are often more than one thing." Owen looked at his paper. "That's not a simple answer." "No," she said. "It isn't. I don't think simple answers are usually honest ones." He turned that over in the way he turned most things, with a thoroughness that was purely his own. Then he went back to his arithmetic. She sat across from him and let him work. In the weeks that followed, the house on Birch Hollow Road became something it had not been in the 11 months Cecily had lived in it. Not peaceful. There was too much unresolved for peace, and some of the unresolved was between her and Franklin, who conducted their necessary conversations with the careful formality of people who are not sure yet what they were to each other. And some of it was inside Owen, who was working through something large and difficult at the pace of a 9-year-old who had decided to take it seriously rather than run from it. But it was honest. For the first time, the house was honest. The thing that had been in the walls was out of them, and what was left was simply what was there. 3 people and 1 difficult old woman, and a reckoning that had arrived later than it should have, and had to be lived with anyway. Mrs. Penelope Farrow came back in June. She came to the house directly this time, at the front door, in the middle of the day, and Mrs. Constance Ashford answered the door and showed her to the front parlor and made tea without being asked, which Cecily noted and did not comment on. Mrs. Farrow sat across from Cecily in the room where Cecily had sat with Mr. Holt and with Franklin, the room that had become, without planning it, the room where things were said that needed saying. "I wanted to come before the summer," Mrs. Farrow said. "I wanted to say something to you in person." "Tell me," Cecily said. "You are the first person in 4 years who wrote to me and asked what I knew," she said, and meant it, and was willing to use the answer. She folded her hands in her lap. "I wrote those letters to people. After Eleanor died, to the county, to the church, to the family solicitor. No one wrote back. I eventually decided that no one was going to, and I was going to spend the rest of my life knowing something true that had nowhere to go." She paused, and then a woman I'd never heard of wrote to me from inside the house itself and asked. Cecily said, "I didn't do it for you. I want to be honest about that." "I know that," Mrs. Farrow said. "You did it because you were living inside the story and you needed to understand what the story was. That is the most useful reason. The useful reasons are always the ones that lead somewhere." They sat in the parlor for another hour. They spoke about Eleanor, not about the scandal of her, but about the person of her, which Mrs. Bald Farrell had been carrying alone for 4 years and seemed glad to put down in a room with another person. By the time Mrs. Farrell left, Cecily knew that Eleanor Ashford had kept a kitchen garden, that she had been a better singer than she'd let on because Franklin had not liked her singing, that she had been afraid of dogs and had loved them anyway, and that she had written in her last letter to her sister that she was tired, so tired, but that she wasn't going to stop. Cecily sat in the empty parlor after Mrs. Farrell left and held all of that. She held it the way you held something breakable, not gripping, just keeping it from falling. Franklin appeared in the doorway. He had come home early again, which had become something he did now. Not dramatically, not as a gesture, but as a quiet adjustment in the schedule of a man who had decided that whatever he was doing in this house needed to happen in it rather than away from it. "She's gone?" he said. "Yes," Cecily said. He came in and stood in the room and looked out the window at the June afternoon. He had been doing this lately, appearing in rooms without an agenda, which was so unlike his previous manner of occupying space that she noticed it every time. "I want to ask you something," he said. He was still looking at the window. "And I'm going to ask it plainly, which I understand I haven't generally done." She waited. "What would you need," he said, "to stay?" She looked at him. The neutral face was not neutral now. The face she had spent 11 months learning to read was, for the first time, not managing anything. It was simply asking. "I would need to know what this is," she said. "Not what it was arranged to be, what it actually is now, and what you intend it to be." "I intend it to be a marriage," he said. "A real one." "I understand I haven't conducted it as one." "No," she said. "You haven't." "I know that." He turned from the window. "I am also aware that knowing it is not enough, and that saying I intend to do differently is not a thing you are obligated to believe." "I'm not," she said. "No." He looked at her with the directness she had learned he possessed and had rarely used, the same quality that was in his business and his accounts and apparently everywhere except, for a long time, here. "I am asking whether you are willing to give me the time to show it rather than just say it." She considered this. She considered it the way she considered the ledgers, not with hope or dread, but with precision. What was actually in the room? What the numbers actually said? "I have nowhere to go quickly," she said. "My cousin Fredericksburg would take me in, but she has 3 children and a small house, and I would not put that on her without necessity." He looked at her. "That isn't a yes," she said. "And it isn't a no. It's what is actually true." "I'll take the actual truth," he said. "I've had enough of the other kind." She looked at him for a long moment, at this man who had done something genuinely wrong and who was not trying to make it less than what it was, which was the thing she had the least ability to dismiss, because she had spent 11 months in a house built on things being made less than what they were, and she was tired of it. "Full transparency on the accounts," she said. "All of them, business and household. I keep both." "Yes," he said. "Whatever Owen needs to work through, he works through without interference. If he asks me questions, I answer them honestly. Yes. And if I decide in 6 months or a year that this is not something I can stay in, you do not obstruct that." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I give you my word." "Your word," she said carefully, "is not something I have a long history with." "I know," he said. "That's the problem I'm asking for time to correct." She looked out the parlor window at the June afternoon, the same window he had been looking out of a minute ago, the same light, the same street where the Millhaven summer was conducting itself with complete indifference to what was happening inside this house. "All right," she said. 6 months. He nodded once. There was no relief visible in his face, which she found more trustworthy than if there had been. Relief would have looked like he'd gotten what he wanted. What his face showed was the expression of a man who understood that something had been offered that hadn't been earned, and who knew the difference. Owen announced at breakfast the following Saturday that he had decided Cecily was allowed to help with his arithmetic from now on permanently. A declaration he made as if he were conferring a title rather than granting a request, and which no one had asked for, and which Cecily accepted with the straightness of face it required. "I'll be there," she said. "You'd better be," he said, and went back to his toast with the authority of someone who had settled the matter. Mrs. Constance Ashford from the end of the table made no comment, but she poured Cecily's tea first that morning, before her own, and she did it without being asked, and she did not acknowledge having done it. It was, from her, a second extraordinary gesture. Cecily counted them. Mr. Holt stopped her on the street in July. He had his hat in his hand, and the expression of a man who had been thinking about saying something for a while and had finally found the moment. "I want to tell you," he said, "that the Pharaoh statement has been forwarded to the county court for the record. It won't open a formal proceeding, most likely. But it exists now. It's in the record." He paused. "Eleanor Ashford's name is in the record as someone who tried to leave and was prevented. That's permanent." Cecily stood on the July sidewalk and felt something move through her that she didn't immediately identify. It wasn't satisfaction. Not exactly. It was something quieter than that. The feeling of a thing having been placed where it belonged. "Thank you," she said. "You did the work," he said. "I printed it." "That's not a small thing," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She walked home. She walked the same route she always walked. Past the post office she had passed on the way home from the register. Past the shops that had belonged to this town long before she arrived in it. Past the houses where the county conducted its daily business of living in close proximity to each other's choices. She thought about Eleanor, who had kept a kitchen garden and been afraid of dogs, and written letters that no one had sent. She thought about what it meant that those letters were in the record now. That Eleanor's name was attached to something true rather than something managed. She thought about a young woman who had arrived in a house 11 months ago, with 2 trunks and a cedar box of her mother's letters, and had understood almost immediately that she was filling a position rather than entering a life. She had not yet found the life, but she had found the truth, and she had learned, as she was beginning to understand she would keep learning, that the truth was the only ground solid enough to build anything on. The house on Birch Hollow Road was still not entirely hers, but it was becoming, slowly and without ceremony, the place where she actually lived. Not the position she'd been appointed to. The life she was making, one careful, unglamorous, precisely documented choice at a time. That was enough to start with. That had always been enough.